welcome to the Second Act podcast. I'm a member of the MuchMusic generation. MuchMusic was, as they called it, the nation's music station. They played music videos and aired music magazine shows. If you grew up in Canada and spent your adolescence there in the 1980s and or 1990s, MuchMusic and its VJs were as much a part of your living room as the furniture and the drapes. The station not only promoted Canadian music acts, but in the process of doing so, they helped shape Canada's cultural landscape. They didn't just promote mainstream acts like Bryan Adams and Corey Hart. They also aired videos by independent artists and francophone musicians from Quebec. They also produced specialty programs showcasing specific genres. When I was 14 years old, hip-hop was my religion, and my week revolved around airings of Rap City. Rap City didn't just rest on its laurels and air mainstream rap acts like Tone Loc, MC Hammer, Rob Bass, and DJ Easy Rock, and Young MC. The producers kept their ears to the ground of the inner cities and their independent record labels. To quote Canadian hip-hop pioneer Maestro Fresh Wes from his hit Drop the Needle, containing a sample from Dance Desire by Haywire, another Canadian music act, "Some MCs like to dance all night, but I like brothers who can rock the mic." How else would I have found out about MC Lyte and APMD? In 1992, I turned 15, and with that transition, music tastes changed. I was seduced by rock and roll. Rap City gave way to the Pepsi Power Hour. I became a fan of grunge, metal, and classic rock. My rock and roll education was underway, and the MuchMusic studio was my remote lecture hall. The 1990s was the golden age of MuchMusic. No longer governed by the exclusive tyranny of plastic pop, pop music was infused with ideas and pathos. Subcultures shaped pop culture, informing young music consumers about the social issues that affected the many varied demographics of society. MuchMusic gave a voice to those who were most closely affected by these issues, i.e., the marginalized, the disenfranchised, and the dispossessed. Or perhaps it's more precise to say that they extended a microphone to them and let them say their piece. MuchMusic didn't tell me who to vote for, but they encouraged me to vote nonetheless. They encouraged me to read. They reached out across the country to make all other regions feel included. That way, everything wasn't Toronto, Toronto, Toronto. They loved being acknowledged, especially since most of the big American music acts skipped most Canadian cities in favor of Toronto. They wanted dessert without dinner. Seduce them with images of scantily clad women and muscle-bound men, and you'll get all their babysitting money. Thinking comes later in life. What MuchMusic discovered, or perhaps intuited, was that teens were thinking. They had opinions, and sometimes they were invited to appear on MuchMusic to express them. But it wasn't just teenagers that were well served by the MuchMusic video diet. The station played plenty of boomer pop, especially in the 80s. Genesis, Phil Collins, Mike and the Mechanics. They had Genesis covered. You would also have seen acts like Huey Lewis and the News, Dire Straits, Rod Stewart, and Robert Palmer. They were also involved in the conspiracy to overexpose fine young cannibals until the point where nobody ever wanted to hear them again. That is, everybody except me. I still love the raw and the cooked. On October 17th, 2017, Canada lost one of its premier musical talents, Gord Downie, lead vocalist, guitarist, and lyricist of TheTragically Hip, arguably Canada's greatest rock and roll band. Though the band's music was developed and produced by the musicians themselves, the effort to introduce them to a wide audience and extol their many virtues in the process was a collaborative effort. It would be inaccurate to say that the Tragically Hip wouldn't have stood a chance without MuchMusic, but they couldn't have gotten a better publicist, and MuchMusic was all too happy to help. Why would the staff take such a personal interest in the trajectory of a Canadian band's success? It would have to be because of their hiring policy when it came to VJs. Co-founder Moses Znaimer didn't want to fill the screen with talking heads. The band Talking Heads would have been welcome to visit the MuchMusic studios anytime, of course. If they had, Znaimer preferred that the VJ interviewing them be someone who was passionate and knowledgeable about music. Anybody can listen to music. Anybody can watch music videos. Not everybody understood music as well as MuchMusic's VJs. A few of them had been songwriters. Had the band Talking Heads stopped by MuchMusic to promote a new record, they might have had the opportunity to talk shop, instead of field questions about what kind of car they drove and the clothes they were wearing. Though to be fair, clothing may have come up from time to time when Jeannie Becker interviewed musicians. There is so much ground to cover considering that I'm dealing with about 20 years of history. When MuchMusic became Much, it was no longer the nation's music station. It was TLC for teens. I had the pleasure of interviewing a gentleman who was with MuchMusic since before its founding moment. Christopher Ward is one of the channel's legendary VJs. He has many stories to tell. You can read some of those stories in his memoir entitled Is This Live? Inside the Wild Early Years of MuchMusic, the nation's music station. The book is available on Amazon as both a paperback and as a Kindle edition. In addition to detailing his history with the station, he interviewed several members of MuchMusic's staff from both on and off camera. He also spoke with many of the Canadian musicians whose careers were made by the exposure they got as their videos were broadcasted from coast to coast to coast. Canada really does have 3 coasts, east, west, and north, in case you're listening from another country. Join me now as I speak with Christopher Ward. Hello, Christopher. It's Morgan. How are you doing?
Hey, Morgan. I'm well. Yourself?
I'm okay. Are you working during this quarantine? Have you found things to do?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, we creative types are self-starters, so we don't need somebody else to get us to go to work. There's no punching of the clock,
Yeah, that's right. When you were working on MuchMusic interviewing people, did you prepare questions in advance there, or did you just wing it?
Oh, there was no winging it for me. I took the line-of-hand approach as well, Morgan. I did a lot of... people thought I was crazy, the amount of research that I would do, and I had all my questions on little 3.5 by 5 cards, and occasionally the artists would tease me. Mm-hmm. Once I was interviewing Neil Young, and he looked down at my little 3.5 by 5 cards, and he goes, "Gee, I wish I had all my answers written on little cards like you."
Yeah, it's interesting.
I said, well, you might come off as a bit over prepared, but
yeah. How did you get that information back then? Like in the 80s, there was no internet. Where did that come from?
It's a really good question. There was a giant filing cabinet which had been in use for many, many years, because before MuchMusic started, there was a show called The New Music. You may know about that.
Oh, yeah.
That was on City TV, and it was a news magazine type show that ran for an hour weekly on Sunday nights. And they had been very involved with the music business for a number of years before Much launched. So they already had this incredible library of interviews of everybody and their mother. They were really sort of the first kind of insiders, the first people to go, on the bus and backstage and, just in the dressing rooms and make sure they got all the scoop. It wasn't the old superficial, typical interviews that you'd see on, Don Kirshner's show or anything. So we had that library of all those interviews to be able to screen when we wanted. But we also had all this, all the record company press releases and copies of magazine articles and all that kind of thing too. So there was quite a bit.
So nowadays, I think actually they're a bit lazy about it. Like I've heard sometimes a person will do an interview, perhaps on terrestrial radio, and the DJ has a laptop open to Wikipedia, which is problematic because Wikipedia articles are not always accurate. And then they're reading off of it while they're interviewing them. But don't you find people appreciate it more if you did do the research?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I've been interviewed a lot. I said, it's like sometimes the questions you get, you're thinking, do you know anything of me? Why are you doing this? You know, you expect people to have some foundation. They don't have to be intimate with your whole life story by any means, but it's just respectful to have some, basis before you go into an interview. I always felt that way because, I thought my job was, first of all, to make the artist feel comfortable in a live television environment, which, wasn't always the easiest task. I think in conclusion, I was saying that I felt that it was a matter of respect for the artist because, my job was to make them feel comfortable in a live television environment, which they didn't always, and then to try to build a bit of a bridge between them and their audience. And familiarity with the artist's work, I think, is essential to be able to do that.
Yeah, the worst example I ever saw was Larry King interviewed Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr together, and he got them confused. How do you confuse the Beatles? You know what I mean? Oh.
Oops.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm interested, actually, in the music influences that shaped you. I know that you're also a songwriter. When you were growing up, what did your parents play on the family hi-fi?
Oh, gosh. Well, my dad was into big band music, swing music, that kind of thing, Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman and the Dorsey Brothers, and listening to Sinatra. My mom loved Judy Garland, and he loved Billie Holiday. So, it was interesting music. It wasn't the typical fare, but at the same time, it wasn't really esoteric either.
Did you think maybe there could have been a subconscious influence when you started writing songs?
No, for me it was all about the Beatles.
Oh, okay.
I mean, because once the Beatles came along, it was just kind of licensed to do whatever you want and just depart completely from previous norms. I mean, you figure there was a whole generation of pop stars in the early 60s who just literally got washed out to sea with the British invasion.
And aside from the Beatles, what other musical heroes and influences did you have as a teenager?
Well, I love the Stones as well. And then, as a late teen, I started to get into, the folk scene and the singer-songwriter era. I was really influenced by Joni Mitchell and Leonard Cohen and Jackson Browne I love writers like Smokey Robinson. He's not a singer-songwriter type, or Lowell George from Little Feat. Just there's Jesse Winchester. So many great songwriters. I could go on all day on that one.
And when you started composing music yourself, what genre was it? How did you wear your influence on your sleeve at that point?
Well, I mean, I think I saw myself as a singer-songwriter type. Just a guy and a guitar. I mean, first of all, I couldn't afford to have a band, but I wanted to be the main songwriter. For me, the main thing was writing songs constantly and getting better and better at doing that. And although I did perform, because that's the only way to get those songs heard when you're first starting out, it wasn't so much about the performance. And so later in my career, when I started working with Alana Miles, I was happy to be the guy in the background writing the songs. That was my sweet spot.
Yeah, and you arrived at a fork in the road as well as a performer, because you at one point joined Second City. What were your long-term aspirations in terms of learning improv and getting involved with comedy?
That's a good question. I don't know that I had any long-term objectives. I think what had happened was I'd gone on a tour with my band that had ended disastrously. we were in Saskatchewan, and there was a club owner that at the end of the week just refused to pay us. And, typically a band's being on the road, you don't have any margin for error. And then a part of the tour got canceled. And so, I kind of came back home to Toronto with my tail between my legs, figuring out what I was going to do. So aside from, just writing songs, I thought, well, maybe I'll try to, just do some professional development, if you like. So I started taking the Second City workshop classes, and I started doing like jazz dancing lessons, just anything that seemed like it might be, a new frontier for kind of improvement as an entertainer. And then to my surprise, at Second City, they asked me if I would audition for the touring company, having seen me work in the workshop program. And they gave me the job. And then this is the funny story. I mean, I tell this with humility, not to brag about it at all, but they hired me over Mike Myers. It's like a standing joke between he and I, because he's an old friend of mine. So. But they eventually figured out that they were better off with Mike.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and actually, it's funny because he started so auspiciously in terms of, like, I remember reading, like, he was hired by Second City the day of his high school graduation. So you probably didn't see that coming.
Well, I remember it well because we were in a van and we were going up to work at... we had a couple of standing gigs, one at the Deerhurst Inn in Muskoka and the other one in Blue Mountain, Collingwood. Was one of the other gig. And we picked Mike up in the suburbs where he lived, and it was the day that he graduated high school. And he had what he described as an ermine tail, like a little chunk of hair behind the back of his head. So I think the ermine tail had to go before he was in the cast, as I recall.
And he appeared on City Limits, and you mentioned that show earlier. So for people who never saw City Limits, how similar was it to what became the established video flow for MuchMusic and all of its content?
Well, Limits was kind of a prototype for MuchMusic. It was a way of showing the CRTC what they would do if City TV people were granted the license for the National Music Channel, because they were kind of the upstarts. I mean, there were bigger names involved, like Rogers and people like that, who were going for the license. But I think the fact that they had been doing the new music for a number of years, and were very involved in the music scene, and also because we were able to do this show called City Limits 2 nights a week, overnight, and it was the kind of model for what Much might look like. It was very loosey-goosey. It was there wasn't a studio per se. There was just all the gear and all the people working on the gear, and me sitting kind of in the midst of them. And interviews would be very loose. People would just drop by. I think that the spirit of it, as much as anything, was what they hoped to convey. And then when they did do their presentation before the commission, they got the license. So I guess it worked.
Moses Znaimer obtained the license for MuchMusic and provided the budget and other resources. I know the budget was pretty slim. He's quite a character, I understand. What was your experience of working with him like?
Well, it's funny. Moses and I got along great. And so I really had actually very little interaction with Moses. The first interaction was when John Martin, who was the program director for Much, came and asked me if I would be interested in doing this all-night video show called City Limits. And I thought, well, I don't know. Let me think about it. My friends all said, "Are you kidding? You get to do anything you want, and you get paid, and you're a starving songwriter? You idiot! Just go take the gig, So I did, but little did I know that John had gone out on a limb for me. He shot a video of me that was like an audition, and taken it up to Moses. But Moses was expecting, 25 audition takes, and Moses played mine. And Moses went, "Oh, yeah, okay, that's good. So what else you got?" And John went, "That's it." And Moses was really pissed. It was like, "What do you mean that's it?" And John said, "Well, this is the guy." which took a lot of balls on John's part, but that was how he operated. And so when I met Moses, that after being hired, that was the first time that we had any encounter at all. But we got along fine. He was very supportive of my work.
Would MuchMusic have been the same without John Martin working on it all those years?
No way. I mean, Moses provided a vision that was kind of superseding all. And, he had already done that very successfully with City TV. But John had an idea. And it was like when John pitched Moses on the idea of doing the new music show, which John produced. He had an idea of how he wanted things to be, and he liked chaos and creativity, and he liked people that were sort of iconoclastic in their natures and who would just go out on a limb and do stuff and take chances. And the riskier, the better. And if we ever did stuff that was like a little across the line for whatever reason, John was the first guy to step up and defend you for taking the risk in the first place.
And during the early brainstorming sessions for MuchMusic, when you were all gathered to determine the format of it, what ideas were rejected? Did the channel almost take on a completely different form?
Well, we'd already done City Limits, so we had that prototype. It was more like, all right, how do we take this little local all-night video show and expand that into something that's like a network show that's a national television program. But at the beginning, I mean, Much was pretty seat of the pants. Mm-hmm. It kind of looked like, it looked like SCTV or something. It was very raw and very loose, and in a way, it was like improv comedy when people go to see it and they love watching the entertainers fall on their faces, and because then they want to see how they get themselves back up on their feet again. And we were very much like that.
Was it John Martin who told you, do whatever you want, just don't spend any money?
Yes. And that quote is absolutely precise. There's no exaggeration in that one.
Yeah. So were your duties just limited to presenting, or did you wear other hats like writing, directing, producing, and so on?
Well, producing was pretty loose. We had a producer assigned for each show, and we would work out what we were going to play. And a lot of the time, we were just thinking about what we were going to do. It's like, if we were going to interview somebody, or an idea would come up in a pre-production meeting where it'd be like, hey, let's do the whole show on the street and then involve the people out on Queen Street, or let's do the show on the roof today, or let's go down to the CNE, or just whatever was available and whatever technologically they could do, we would be up for it. And myself, the other thing that I was involved in was the programming, and it was really just by default, because I had, while I was going to college, worked at a radio station. It was actually in the Chum organization as it happened. It was CKPT in Peterborough, Ontario. And while I was there, the program director asked me to help out with the programming. I guess he thought, I'm a musician, I'm interested in music, I'm listening to all the new stuff, and, I might be able to help him do that. So I did, and it gave me an understanding of how a format worked. Well, a format was kind of a bad word in those days. It was a suggestion of, corporate nefarious influence. It was a suggestion of structure where there should be freedom. But it didn't have to be. I looked upon it as a way of making sure that we played all the things that we were really excited to play, and all the stuff that we really believed in, and the artists that we chose to support, particularly Canadian ones. So I actually drew up the first format and sat in on the programming committee meeting every week where we considered all the new videos.
And going from the planning stage to actually being in front of the camera, what did you find to be the most challenging aspect of being a VJ?
Challenging. I don't know. I loved it, Morgan. It was a great gig. I had a lot of fun. I felt like it was a natural thing for me to do because I was talking about the thing that I loved, which was music. I got to interview amazing artists. I mean, you know, you go from 0 to 60 really quickly, and you suddenly you find yourself, you know, interviewing Whitney Houston or Janet Jackson or, you know, The Edge or Paul McCartney. I mean, it was just crazy, you know, the things that happened. And you didn't really have time to stop and think, oh gosh, is this challenging? Is this difficult? Am I doing a good job? I mean, I would look back occasionally at some of my on-air work, particularly the interviews, because I wanted to try to be a better interviewer. Because I guess now that to answer your question properly, that was the most challenging thing, was trying to be a good interviewer. Because it's really easy to blow an interview.
Yeah,
to lose the energy and the momentum that you've created, to ask a stupid question or not ask the right question or not pick up on something that the artist is giving you as a lead into something. And there's a lot of ways to blow it. And pacing is so important. And yeah, so that actually was the most challenging now that I think of it.
And who was the member of the MuchMusic team that you had the strongest creative chemistry with?
Oh, I think, well, I loved working with a lot of the people. I mean, the ones that got hired to be the producers was this group of really like young kids, like straight out of Centennial College in their young 20s. And I'm talking about Sherry Greengrass, Morgan Fleury, Terry Walsh, and Simon Evans. But Simon used to produce City Limits, not City Limits the all-night show, but City Limits the alternative show on Much. And so we worked together a lot, and we still are great friends, and we had a really good creative relationship.
And speaking of creative relationships, you co-hosted the Faraj program, which is one of the things you're most known for in terms of MuchMusic.
Yeah.
Was there ever any blowback from the artists whose videos were presented in that program?
No, because, I mean, the Faraj was my show, so I got to say what went on and what didn't. And my only rule was no Canadian artists.
Oh, okay.
So
yeah.
we wouldn't run into any blow. I mean, you know, there were times when it was tempting because, let's face it, Canadians were just as capable of making a ridiculous video as anybody else. But I felt like maybe this is because I'd been an artist myself and I had an understanding of how much of a struggle it is to try to survive as an artist in Canada and all the things that you have working against you. You know, just the lack of resources, the lack of good managers, geography. So it would have seemed like piling on if we were then going to, you know, mock those artists' work. So that was the only rule that we had.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and the music industry is very different now. It's no longer about selling units. And discovering new artists. It's not as easy as sitting down in front of the TV and watching videos. Do you think this is a better way to do things, or does it present a disadvantage to the artists?
You mean the way it is now?
Yeah, it's about streaming, and there's no channel playing music videos, I don't think, anymore.
You know, Morgan, it's just different. Everything changes. I mean, we can't ever sort of cling on too tightly to a beloved era in music or television or any aspect of culture, because before you know it, it's going to change. Mm-hmm. And music, the way I look at it is that it depends on a constant infusion of creative energy from new people, younger artists. And like when I listen now, I could be listening to, you know, a 22-year-old like Phoebe Bridgers or something, and I could just be as inspired as I was, you know, listening to people who are 3 times her age. Mm-hmm. You got to keep your mind open to the way things are in reality. And right now, streaming is the reality. Hard record sales, you know, there's no retail outlets anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, every industry goes through upheaval, and some adapt better than others. I mean, I think we went through a really, you know, low period for a while in terms of support for artists, because the streaming services, they just weren't providing anywhere near the revenues for royalties that the traditional record sales were. So, but I see that streaming services are now, spitting out royalties at a better rate, and there's a more fair distribution, hopefully ahead of those royalties. It's complicated, but I'm always hopeful that there's something brand new and incredibly exciting tomorrow.
And when you're recognized by people who watched MuchMusic and remember you, what kind of things do they usually say? Fromage! Yeah, that's
one of them. It's a different cohort. We're talking quite a few years ago now, Martin.
Yeah,
and also I live in LA, so I don't see very many people here that recognize me from MuchMusic. But when I go back to Canada, people do still. It amazes me. I think, how in God's name do you even know who I am? But they'll ask me like, well, what was it really like back then? Because it looked so chaotic and so crazy, and I guess that's why I called the book I wrote "Is This Live?" because people never really knew whether it was or not. They'll ask me about, well, what's Erica doing now? Or, just random stuff. Or, hey, you interviewed George Harrison, didn't you? What was that like? It's kind of an updated version of fan questions from back in the day, really.
Yeah, and musicians, they can be a pretty volatile bunch sometimes. So what interview, if any, could you cite as being your favorite that you remember most fondly?
Well, there were a lot of them. I mean, George Harrison was just such an amazing point in our history, having a Beatles walk into MuchMusic Live and sit down for an hour. I mean, I sort of felt like that was the interview that I've been prepping for my entire life. And, of course, if you've seen any of that interview, you'll know he's everything you would hope. He's witty and genteel and generous-spirited. That was just a fantastic moment, but for me, but a lot of that was personal too, because that's the music that made me want to pick up a guitar and play, and just kind of helped form who I became as a writer, and maybe as a human being too. But aside from that, I mean, interviewing Leonard Cohen was pretty amazing, because I'd grown up reading his books of poetry. And I was, really inspired by him. So that was the most intimidating one. But again, he turned around to be as gracious and generous with his time as you could possibly imagine. So, but there were a lot of fun ones. Tracy Ullman, do you know who she is?
Yeah, the comedian, the actress, yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the most hilarious interviews for sure. It was just complete wackiness and chaos, and she was hysterically funny and just rolled with it completely. So that one was a lot of fun. I mean, again, there's so many, I can just keep going. So,
and there are a lot of people who kind of turn on a personality once they're on camera. Who was the nicest behind the scenes? Like they're on their way to the studio. There's some preliminaries going on. Who'd you find to be the nicest people?
We didn't really do a lot of preliminaries. The way that it worked was oftentimes the bigger artists in particular were on a very tight schedule. So they would move from, one interview to another. They'd be squired around by record company people and so on. So the only real kind of downtime you'd have would be while the video was playing. And I think one of the nicest people was Kate Bush. And it's funny because, I liked Kate Bush's music, and in particular the album that she had out at the time, which I'm going to forget the name of now, the one with Running Up That Hill on it, Cloud Busting. She was one of those artists who was so revered by her fans that when people heard I was interviewing Kate Bush, it was like touching the hem of the garment. And it was like a religious experience for them. They couldn't believe that I was actually going to be sitting down with her. And she was sweet and sort of almost academic and so earnest, like really sincere. And we had a great chat in between, the fall part of the interview. So she was great. But there were a lot of artists like that. Mm-hmm. I think because what happened is they would come in there and they would be genuinely surprised by what they were seeing. Because, I don't know if you ever walked into the MuchMusic studios back in those days.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, once.
Then you maybe knew what to expect, but artists coming from other places, other countries, let's say a typical American artist, they would have seen MTV, and everything was pretty buttoned down at MTV. All the intros were scripted and written out beforehand. They were rehearsed, and they did them directly to camera until they got it right. And there wasn't until much later, when they started loosening up and just, incorporating some more random elements into their programming. So an artist would walk in, and it would just be like chaos in there. And, the telephones would be ringing, and people would be zooming back and forth across the room. And a lot of them would think, well, where's the interview going to be? We go, right here.
Yeah.
They go, oh, how do you work in this environment? I said, I love it. They went, okay. And then gradually, most of them would kind of get right into the spirit of it. It would really loosen them up. I mean, some artists were born for that, like Crowded House or somebody like that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But then there were other artists like Janet Jackson who was terrified. We had to literally go into the audio booth, which was tiny. So I sat knee to knee with Janet while we did the interview because she was just so intimidated by the chaos that was ongoing at Much. So, different artists reacted different ways.
Yeah, and I know that there were some interviews that kind of fell apart because the artist, took umbrage with a question or something and maybe stormed off. And one thing I remember was that there seemed to be a belief behind the scenes, like, if something like that happens, it may be awkward for the people who are present, but it makes for interesting television. Was that how everyone saw it?
You got it exactly right, Morgan. As long as it makes for good TV, everything is forgivable.
Yeah.
So yes, some storming did take place. I remember Steve Anthony had a particularly contentious interview with the Ramones, and then he said, "Well, if you guys are going to give me one more monosyllabic answer, I'm going to reach over with these scissors and cut your bangs." And Joey Ramone leans and he goes, "If you do that, I'll take those scissors and slam them into your neck." It was just like, oh.
Death threat.
Okay. He was words to that effect. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was like, oh,
and
not happy.
Out of all the interviews you conducted, which one would you describe as the worst, just absolute train wreck, the most awkward?
Oh, there are a few of those, boy. I'm trying to remember. I probably put some of them in the book. You should remind me. I remember Elvis Costello was tough.
Oh, yeah.
But, with that one, he's a very crusty guy at the best of times. But it was, I was a big fan, and I knew my stuff. I was ready for that interview. And I'm very excited to do it. And unfortunately, he didn't come down to the studio, so we did it in a hotel room at the Four Seasons. So it was all automatically a little stultified. He really kind of got in my face and challenged me a couple of times. And at the time, I thought, this is just awful. This is just a terrible interview. I've completely failed. And here's a guy who I think is a fantastic artist. I must have taken the wrong approach on this thing. And I lived on believing that. I never looked at the interview again. And then I looked at it while I was writing the book, because I thought, well, I'll talk about some of my worst experiences. And I watched it and I realized, you know what? It was a good interview. And it was good because he took charge, and it was his feisty, irascible personality at its best. And sure, he was challenging me. And yeah, I felt awkward in a couple of spots, but so what?
Yeah.
Look what I got out of it. It's this great interview. And it was like a real transformation for me to be able to see it 30 years later and realize that it wasn't at all, what I thought it was at the time. Other than that, there were the standard issue things where, these young bands would come in and they just thought they were the shit, and that they owned the world because they had one hit, which got old, as you can imagine.
Well, I mean, if an interview, starts turning into that kind of awkward situation, how can the viewer not pay attention,
Well, you're right. Sometimes if it gets really, really awkward, it can make the compelling TV that you refer to. I'd say there is one that I remember that kind of went sour for a whole different set of reasons. Do you remember a band called the Jesus and Mary Chain?
Yes.
Well, the band was basically two brothers, the Reed brothers. And I found out something interesting way after the fact. I was interviewing a record company guy for the MuchMusic book, and he had been in charge of the Reed brothers on the occasion of my interview and was bringing them to the station. And I said, "Oh, what do you remember of that occasion?" He said, "Well," he said, "they were walking down Queen Street, and one of them stopped to look in the window of a comic book store and was talking about, the comics that he was looking at in the window and so on. And the other guy started berating him, saying that he was an asshole, he was a child, he was an idiot for liking comic books. And they proceeded to have like a full-out rumble on the sidewalk and rolled into the street to the point that the streetcar had to stop and the driver had to get out and get them off the track so that he could continue. And I don't know how the record company rep handled it, but they came straight from there. I think they had a couple of quick drinks beforehand, but they came straight from there essentially and sat down to be interviewed. So you got these two guys who are not happy to be in the same room together, and they were Scottish, and their accents were so heavy, I couldn't understand anything they were saying. I mean, literally, it was just like gibberish to my ears. So I would ask a question, and I'd say, "Well, so how are things going, on the beginnings of your tour?" And they'd be like, "Oh, correct, the thing with the guitars, the touring, and I would go, and then I would just wait until he finished, stop talking, and then I would ask my next question. And that's how we got through the Jesus and Mary Chain interview. But it's funny now, and I don't know. I suspect that people couldn't tell at the time, but maybe I'm wrong.
So I was wondering, did you ever get acquainted with the Tragically Hip and Gord Downie at all?
I did not. I ran into them at it was backstage at the Junos, I think. And I'm trying to remember the name of the guitar player, Paul.
Yeah, there's a guy named Paul. I forget his last name. Langlois or something like that.
Langlois, yeah. Well, there's Paul, but there's another guy, the guitar player with the really super long hair.
Gord Sinclair, yeah.
And he looked at me across the room backstage, and we were quite a distance apart, and he went, "Fromage!"
Fromage, yeah.
I thought, oh, God, this is my calling card, like it or not. But, no, I never did interview the Hip or anything. I mean, they're a fantastic band. They're one of the greatest Canadian bands of all time, but I did not have the pleasure.
Is there an artist who, you found that their image was so contrived that it didn't reflect the real person? Did you ever see someone just be complete? Did you ever find out wow, they're nothing at all like they are in a video?
Oh, well, I interviewed Adam Ant once, and I don't know how you would describe his personality in video. It's pretty playful, but he was kind of a cool guy, what do they call it? New romantic music, was that what the title was at the time?
Yeah. And
he was a hugely successful artist. I interviewed him in London. But in person, he was kind of aristocratic, and he had a wicked sense of humor. And he was doing theater at the time, because it was sort of after his big heyday by a few years. So that, it was interesting. There's a little bit of a disconnect between the video person and the guy you met. I'm trying to think of a better example.
Did you ever meet Michael Jackson or interview him?
No. He never came to much music that I know of.
Oh.
I don't think he did very many interviews, really.
Yeah, that's true. I don't think he did a lot, no.
Like Prince didn't do interviews for a long time as well.
Yeah, that's right. And so what is it that you do these days? Are you doing some music journalism, or is it mostly songwriting, or are you doing both?
Well, I'm doing a bunch of stuff. I've been working, aside from writing book, I've got a couple of book projects that are in the works. And I'm writing a lot of songs right now, because I'm going to do a recording project in Toronto this summer. And, I've got a podcast called Famous Lost Words, which I do with a fellow named Tom Jokic. He's the producer of the Roger Ashby, Marilyn Dennis show. Well, it's called something different now because Roger left. On the morning show on Channel FM. And so we play, he has this amazing archive that he has access to of interviews going back to the 1950s when Chum began.
Wow.
And he'll pull out all these bits from these interviews, and then we'll just yak about them. And it is such a blast to do. We have so much fun doing it. So we're into about our 5th season now, I guess.
Are you able to do that with the quarantine going on?
Oh yeah, I just plug a mic in and go. I mean, we can see each other on Zoom, and then I do a separate recording on GarageBand, and then just send him the audio file that he puts together. Okay,
and so the book about MuchMusic, is it live? So that's available on Amazon as a paperback and as a Kindle edition. Where else is it available for purchase?
Well, I'm not sure, Morgan. I mean, certainly at the beginning, it was available in, all of the, the bookshops. Indigo had it prominently displayed for a long time. I mean, I would think you could go to any bookstore, particularly the big ones like Indigo, and if they didn't have it in stock, then you'd be able to order it pretty darn quickly from Random House. So,
and was it difficult to get the interviews from all the musicians you spoke to for the book?
No, it was a piece of cake. Everybody wanted to talk. And I think it's because it was a golden era for so many people. It was an era that they look back. I mean, as Alan Frew said, it's like looking back at your high school yearbook, and sometimes you cringe, but for the most part, you laugh about it, right? And I had great conversations, and sometimes with people that I had interviewed back in the day, like with Mike Reno. I remember, I said, yeah, and I sent him a picture of he and I from that era, and we got a good laugh out of that. And then sometimes it was with people that I'd never met before. Certainly people that I'd never interviewed. I mean, it was great. People were so open-hearted. I think for me, like, because people, at the time I was an on-air person at MuchMusic, I was a VJ. But because they know me as a songwriter now, I think that sort of helps open doors when you're talking to musicians.
Sure, yeah.
Because it becomes more peer-to-peer kind of conversation.
Yeah, because I remember reading in your book, there's a VJ, I forget her, I think her name was Angela Dorr, was it? Is that her name?
Angela Dorman, yeah.
Oh, that's right, yeah. So she was not as well versed in music as the rest of you were, and she really struggled because of that, didn't she?
Well, actually, see, Angela was an actor, and a really good one. She ended up having a regular part on Seinfeld for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And she was so charming and very witty and quick on her feet that whatever she didn't know, she found a way to make up for it.
Oh, yeah, that's good, yeah.
And, so, I mean, you think about the people who were on air and where they came from. I mean, J.D. Roberts, along with myself, was the first of the VJs. And his background was, I guess you could call it music journalism with the new music, before his career as a straight news guy. But, when Denise came on air, I mean, her background had been working as a booking agent, but, with somebody with an incredible passion and knowledge of music. I think Kim Clark Champness was a musician, like a DJ kind of musician in those days. Steve had more of a radio background. Master T, Tony Young, he was a musician. There were actors, musicians, just comedians, people from different aspects of the entertainment business. And I think that made for a more kind of diverse presentation.
Yeah, and one thing I heard about the death of the music video era, I mean, I know they're still being made and shown mostly on the internet, but what I heard is that in the beginning, the record labels agreed not to charge royalties for them to be shown, but then they turned around in the late 90s and decided they wanted royalties for the broadcasting of the videos. Is that what happened, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I was long gone from MuchMusic by the late 90s, so I don't remember the politics of the situation, Morgan, but I do remember at the beginning they were free, and, for an outlet like MuchMusic, who, initially didn't really have much in the way of revenue, they certainly weren't able to charge very much for commercial content, because remember, right at the beginning, they weren't even on basic cable, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So they had to build a base, and the whole idea of free music videos, it was just looked upon as a fair exchange. It's like, okay, we get this free programming, which is fantastic, and we play the daylights out of it, and it helps you sell a whole lot of records. So I think there's a pretty good understanding of that. But I suspect what happened at a certain point is that the videos started to get more and more expensive, and underwriting the cost of them from a label's point of view must have become more and more challenging as time went by, and so they were probably looking for ways to monetize it. I remember there was a time when videos were being sold quite a bit. An artist would package together like 4 or 5 of their best videos and sell it in record stores. And that era lasted for a little while too.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And before we go, if you want to promote your other books.
Oh, well, I have one with Dunder and Press called Dead Brilliant, which is the story of an artist whose career hits a brick wall, whose personal life falls into shambles, and whose manager, who is his oldest friend, convinces him that the best way to resuscitate his career would be to fake his own death. So they do that very successfully, and he starts selling all kinds of records, and he starts creating new music from the vaults, in effect. And it goes along really, really well until he realizes that being dead has its limitations.
Yeah.
So that's Dead Brilliant, and you might get a laugh out of that one.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely on the comedic side. And I have a couple of kids' books out too.
Oh, what are they called?
One is called Mac in the City of Light. It's about I wrote it for my daughter, because at the time when we were reading books together, all the heroes were boys. So I said, well, we'll fix that.
Yeah.
So I wrote a book, and we were living in Paris at the time. So I wrote it, and her middle name is Mackenzie, so I called the hero of the book Mac. So it was Mac in the City of Light, and that's it's sort of like a tween novel.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a full YA young adult novel, and it's not like a picture book. It's somewhere in between. I guess if you were like in the sort of 9 to 12 zone.
How do you like living in the States as a Canadian?
Well, this is my second stretch. The first time I was here was in the 90s, and I lived here for 11 years. And I know it well. I know what to deal with. And, my daughter's here. That's the principal draw of California for me, to be honest.
Well, thank you so much for doing this interview. Before we go,
You're welcome, Warren.
Yeah, thank you. Do you use social media at all?
Yes. There's a site called Much Memories on Facebook.
Oh, okay. So
So
that's when I can link to that?
Yeah, and then there's also a Christopher Ward site. You can see different things that I've done there. I'm not the most active person. I'm not like on Instagram every hour updating and posting and doing all of that. I just I get distracted by other things, like my guitar calls to me, or there's a book I want to read.
Sure, yeah,
So,
inspiration, yeah. All right, well, thank you so much again, and have yourself a great day, and I'll email you to when the episode is finished.
thanks, Morgan.
All right.
Appreciate your time today.
Yeah, I appreciate yours. Thank you. Take
care now.
Take care. Bye-bye. I'm going to leave you with Christopher Ward's interview with George Harrison. Thank you for listening to the Second Act podcast. Bye for now.
Admittedly, it's a surprise, but it's a very great pleasure to welcome George Harrison to MuchMusic. George, welcome.
Good afternoon. Nice to be here.
It's nice to have you here.
Thank you.
I'm sorry we couldn't forewarn our viewers, but
That's okay.
it's good nonetheless. Cloud9, congratulations on the incredible success of it. A number one single, among other things.
Thank you.
It sounds like there's a lot of joy on that record, that you had a really good time making this record.
It was fun, very, very good fun, you know. We just went out there just to make a nice record and be happy making it, and that's how it came out.
Did the time off between Gontrapo and that record, did that change the way that you worked on the record?
Yeah, it certainly helped, because I was a bit tired of making records by about 1981. Thought I'd have a rest, and by the time I felt like I did keep writing. You know, I got a studio at home, kept writing those years while I never made an album. But during those years, when I felt it was a good time to make a record, but the one thing was to have a producer, because on my previous records I'd worked all alone. I got a bit bogged down, I felt, and I needed a bit of input, you know. So that's when I figured out Jeff Lynne would be good, and so went out and hunted him down and tricked him into producing it.
The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. First of all, what that presentation meant to you?
Well, I must say, it didn't mean anything to me until I got there, because, you know, it's just some idea somebody had, and, you know, it's only been 2 or 3 years. It didn't really mean that much to me, but somebody said, you know, it mightn't seem like much now, but it is history, and you'll enjoy it. So I went along, and I was glad I went. Had a great night after everybody settled down. It was a bit hectic. And it was fantastic just to see all those people, and Little Richard, and, you know, all the guys there. Really enjoyed it. But now, as I've got my little statue that says the Beatles Hall of Fame, and I'm sure as it goes more into the future, you know, it's going to be something which I'm certainly glad I didn't miss it.
Are you saddened that Paul McCartney wasn't able to appear?
For him, it's a pity he missed it, because he would have had a good time. You know, and it was nice to see people saying, well, after all that we've done, you know, that's all it was, really. Get the lads here, give them a pat on the back, and give them the medal. And it's a shame he missed it, because he contributed so much to it. But it didn't spoil our night. We still had fun without it.
How did you feel when you heard the McCartney versions of the old songs on Broad Street?
I think they were okay. I didn't notice that they were new versions. I only watched it once. I quite liked it, but I don't really... I remember dancing, all that one about ballroom dancing and stuff. I don't remember the old ones.
He said that he wanted to tackle some of the other old songs, including possibly some of John Lennon's songs, like Beautiful Boy and Imagine. Does that surprise you that he would do that?
Paul?
Yeah.
Maybe because he ran out of good ones of his own.
Well, now we've got that on record.
Well, it's true.